everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Lory Barsdate Easton. She earned her master's in psychology at Divine Mercy University and her JD from Yale Law School. A retired lawyer, she previously litigated mass torts cases at a multinational law firm. Her leadership roles on the diversity and professional development committees at her law firm sparked her interest in the psychological aspects of cross-group interactions and personal professional flourishing. In recent years, Lory has presented to the American Psychological Association, the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling, and other conferences and webinars on topics including humility for professionals, vocation as an aspect of identity, the experience of grief and non-death loss associated with career change, and the integration of spirituality in psychotherapy. Her research interests include cultural humility, peer and coaching support for grief and loss, and identity development over the lifespan. She also frequently presents reflections for the Orthodox Christian Attorney Network, OCAMPR, monthly women's coffee hour, and she is a founding board member of Focus North America, the Fellowship of Orthodox Christians United to Serve. Wow, what an honor.
Thank you all for being here after lunch on a Saturday when we've been through a pretty amazing experience already, and it's not even over. Let's talk about work. We all do a lot of it, and so it's not surprising at all that as a human endeavor, we've managed to mangle it. I just want to start with a stained glass window that shows the Martha and Mary. And the reason that I really like this one is that they didn't forget the halo on Martha. She too was a saint. and I think that all of us who at various times have worked too much or too hard can bear in mind that Christ admonished us all to be like Mary, but that Martha's role also is important and in fact salvific. So just a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about work and work addiction and how work and identity can go together, and then discuss vocation. I think a lot of us who are here at OCAMPR, possibly every one of us, experiences work as a calling in some way. And there's a lot of very interesting psychological research on the secular benefits of experiencing work as a calling, and also on the dark side of experiencing work as a calling. And then in talking about how to deal with disordered relationships with work, my fundamental point and take home is going to be that the virtue of humility is actually the foundation for a healthy work calling. So work, identity, how often do people ask, what do you do? Like we've been sitting at lunches over in the dining hall. It's an important part of our identity as adults, certainly in our culture, how we spend our time, how we earn our living. And it's not just about how we earn our living. It's not just about the Benjamins. And coming with our work also comes things that are really healthy and really positive aspects of our narrative about ourselves, including a healthy sense of accomplishment, the sense of being a contributor either to a group or an individual project that's of some importance. It brings us a very important element of social connection and interaction. Work friends are important to all of us. It gives structure to our lives. We all know how COVID disrupted that. And when people were working from home, one of the challenges was how difficult it was to structure your life without that external work schedule. It gives us social status, which is why people are constantly asking, what do you do? I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm a retired lawyer. I had practiced law for decades and relocated from an office here in Chicago to Washington, D.C. because my husband had felt a calling to public service following 9/11. And the very first events that I went to in Washington, D.C., a cocktail party at the home of one of my law partners, people were asking me where I went to law school. No one had asked me where I went to law school for almost 20 years. I'd been practicing law in Chicago, but in Washington, D.C. in particular, the culture is such that it's extremely important to credentialize yourself, sort of at the beginning of every conversation. And so understanding that, yes, D.C. is an extreme, but that reflects something about the American culture, we can see a way that this could easily get into some things that aren't terribly healthy. But work itself isn't a punishment. Work itself is not a curse. In fact, it was right there in Genesis that God's first command to humanity was to co-create with Him. So work predates the fall. And I can tell you, this kind of blew my mind as I started to think about the theology of work. But you read in the Old Testament prophets about what paradise will be like, the little bits of glimpses that we get through those revelations from God. And it's not a non-stop streaming of Netflix. I mean, all of eternity might be enough for me to get caught up on all of the different episodes of Star Trek that I would like to watch, but that's not what paradise is. And in fact, think about it, if we're being led into the land of milk and honey, someone's going to have to milk the cows. Someone's going to have to tend the bees. And the vision is that in paradise, you'll enjoy the fruits of your labor. But resulting from the fall, our relationship with work involves toil and suffering. Now, work in this vision from Genesis, in this idea, can and should be a path to holiness. We've got this commandment that being good stewards of creation is a way that we can reflect God's work and God Himself. We have to bear in mind that it's the calling to follow Christ that has to be at the root of every calling that we perceive, including our vocational call. So, following the fall, you've got the possibility, and in fact almost inevitability, of disordered relationship with labor. We're going to suffer. The snake's going to bite our heel. I mean, it's all there. And one manifestation of that is, as related to the theme of this conference, addiction to work. So what is workaholism? I'm just going to, for those of you who are into the literature in this area, I'm just going to right up front acknowledge that I deliberately and intentionally conflate work addiction and workaholism. I will use them interchangeably. I will be referring to the same thing when I am talking about them. There is a line in the psychological research that attempts to distinguish workaholism from work addiction and talk about some of the positives of workaholism. My own view is that literature is kind of misguided because really what they're talking about is a different construct, which is work engagement that has positive effects. And so workaholism, work addiction, in our conversation today are going to both be talking about disordered relationships with work that have the characteristics of a behavioral addiction. There's something about it that's compulsive. There's something about it that feels out of control. It's differentiated from hard work. It's differentiated from ambition, but involves a cycle and compulsion and has negative impacts on your life. And in recent years, workaholism and work addiction are being better defined in the literature in the way we saw today in the presentation, actually on digital addiction, in ways that mirror what's already in the DSM as addiction criteria. And this would be a way of breaking down the components of work addiction in a parallel to what's in the DSM-5, talking about salience, mood modification, tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, conflict, and relapse. To just dwell a little bit on a couple of these, Salience and conflict go very closely together when work has become the single most important activity for you, when you're constantly thinking about work, when you find it impossible to completely disengage from work even when you're not at work, when you're prioritizing work over other obligations and particularly over other relationships. And that's where conflict comes in, because you are neglecting your relationships with your family and your friends because of work and time spent working. There's also a very important element, frankly, of mood modification. We've been talking a lot this weekend about how these addictions really do start out as medicines. We're trying to make ourselves feel better about something. And using work as a coping strategy to regulate your moods, and especially using work as escape. I mean, we all know someone who works really hard in part so that they don't have to face the challenges that they're dealing with at home. And so these components of addiction apply to work just as to other behavioral addictions. Now, I want to distinguish workaholism or work addiction from work engagement. It was really frustrating to me as a young lawyer. I had one friend who constantly accused me of being a workaholic. I worked really, really long hours as a young lawyer. And that's the way you build an experience base. That's the way that you build, your career is through experience. And when you have 3,000 chargeable hours in a year, you have done more things than someone who has done 1,500 chargeable hours in a year. And so I was working very hard, but I was very offended at the suggestion that I was addicted to work because I could leave it when I was not working. I was choosing to work hard, but I was not neglecting my family. I was still engaged in my hobbies. And I think that, looking back on it, I may have been escaping a little bit, but, I married him eventually. So these things do have a way of working out with God's help. But the hard worker can mentally and emotionally detach from work. The compulsive worker really is constantly stewing about it. The hard worker maintains boundaries and can return to those boundaries even after a work binge, a big project, a huge deadline. You can get back to something. That's a lot harder for someone whose relationship with work is disordered and who, in fact, is primarily using work as an escape from other challenges in life or obligations. And it's interesting because hard work and work engagement typically are highly rewarded in our society. Counterintuitively, workaholism often is not, because people who have work addiction and disordered relationships with work often end up with problems with job performance. And that's actually one of the ways that you can identify the syndrome, is that they're not performing well despite performing a lot. Now, what are some risk factors for becoming addicted to work? Well, of course, the environmental pressures are just absolutely enormous. Everybody's got to pay the bills. There's tremendous reward for working harder. There are organizational rewards. There are rewards among your peers. All of these things reinforce the behaviors that can drift into workaholism. I've just mentioned already some of the coping mechanisms, the ways that compulsive work can be an escape. We've talked about trauma and addiction. This is absolutely in that same category. When you are dealing with a workaholic client, just watch, because there's somewhere in there some trauma. And it may be childhood, it may be achievement related, frankly. Interestingly, personality traits do come into this, but they might not be the ones that you expect. The real signal for danger in work addiction is actually rigidity combined with conscientiousness. So if you have a personality and where you are inclined to be very careful, very conscientious, leaning towards perfectionism, and that isn't flexible or resilient, that's a real red flag and danger for drifting into work addiction. And there are the real basic ones. We all want to feel good about ourselves. We all want to feel appreciated. We all want to feel like what we're doing is important and that we're competent and that we're kind of in control, at least of our little corner of the universe. And those desires, when they grow out of proportion, can really feed a work addiction. So there are a few things that I want to just point out that workaholism is not. And the first is that, unfortunately, it's just not socially unacceptable. It is, the best dressed addiction that you will ever find, and it's one that is the least stigmatized. And just any church coffee hour, kind of listen in. Who's humble bragging about how busy they are at work? Oh, I got a brand new client, and I've got to travel this week to working on. This is socially acceptable, and in fact, reinforced. And another thing that it's not is, honestly, although we are using the addiction framework to talk about it, and I'm absolutely firmly convinced it is an addiction, it's not just like all other behavioral addictions, because the wall that you hit is very private and very different. And up to that point, no one is going to say to you that what you're doing is outrageous and unhealthy or in some way stigmatized. You're just a phenomenal worker. You're the biggest producer. You're getting the bonuses for all of the business that you're bringing in. Whatever it is, it's different, and frankly, that makes it harder to treat, because you can't just say abstain. People have to work. As a treater, you have to be realistic about that when you're trying to help someone with work addiction, and it can't be a not one drink ever scenario. They're going to have to keep on working. And so you're going to have to be realistic in negotiating how to help a person who is addicted to work. Another way it's very different from other disorders is it's not a formally recognized mental health disorder. That has implications, yes, for insurance, but most of all for research. So it's very difficult to say what are the evidence-based responses to something where there's really no agreement about what the criteria are for even diagnosing the condition. And I do want to flag in that department of criteria and diagnosis, even though we all talk about workaholism, work addiction, and burnout as if they were the same thing, burnout, at least in the psychological literature, is a completely different construct. And that's a bit tricky. It doesn't really make sense, frankly, but I'm going to tell you what's in the literature, and then once again say, let's talk about it, sort of very, very broadly and very generally. So burnout is in the ICD-11. So it's a World Health Organization identified phenomenon, but it's not a mental health disorder. What it is a mental health occupational hazard. What does that even mean? It means that it's tied in its definition specifically to organizational structures. So I guess that means that if you're self-employed, you can't be burned out. I think that this falls apart and is just crying out for a better set of definitions. But just so you all know, that the definition, according to World Health Organization, is that it's a syndrome that results from chronic workplace stress that is not successfully managed. Notice the passive voice. Who's supposed to be doing the managing? Is it the worker? Is it the organization? Is it both? That's part of my frustration with the definitions in this field. But the criteria for burnout are different from workaholism in this regard. The number one criteria is exhaustion. And that doesn't necessarily rise to the top with workaholism, although it can come into play. And the other distinguishing feature of burnout is you stop caring. And that's not a criterion at all for workaholism. If you're seeing somebody who's really cynical, who's really distant, who's really in all candor saying, I'm having a hard time caring about my patients, that is the dead ringer for burnout, according to the literature. Now, the relationship between work addiction and burnout, it's complex. First of all, it's complex because nobody can agree on a definition for work addiction, but also there are mediators and moderators, some of which I'm not even sure have been completely identified yet. There are a couple of interesting recent studies coming out on PsyCap, which is psychological capital. It's that combo platter of things that help us to get through life: self-efficacy, optimism, hope, resilience. And when PsyCap is high, it buffers against work addiction, but not necessarily burnout, which is what points to the organizational aspects of burnout. Job satisfaction comes into play, and in ways that are really complicated because obviously there are also individual characteristics and individual coping strategies that go into the mix too. So disordered work relationships can have these three different names, and I'm presenting a fairly unified way of thinking about them for purposes of this conference. Assessing a disordered relationship with work, well, first of all, look at the signs. They're behavioral and emotional and relational. If your friends, family are complaining about if your client is isolated, if your client is losing sleep, there are physical problems, the stress-related illnesses, but the first and foremost ones are simple things like what's called tech neck, from looking at your computer for too long, just long hours and without relief can actually lead to physical symptoms. I'm going to pass around for everybody to take a look at a couple of take your pile and pass them down that way. The standardized work addiction scales for us to look at and compare. I'll give you a Bergen one. Thanks. Those are all the same. So there should be two scales: the Bergen work addiction scale and the work addiction risk test. So the long one that has two sides, the work addiction risk test.
Thank you.
It starts out, I prefer to do most things for myself rather than ask for help. This is the older of the two standards.
The one that's page 2.
The one that's 2 pages and 25 items.
You just got page 1.
Do you need one?
Yeah, it was.
There you go.
I forgot a page.
There you go. Oh, well, it should be a front and back. You probably got my master. There you go.
Oh.
But
Thanks.
anyway, the work addiction risk test is the older of the two. Does everybody have one that's two-sided and one that's short and one-sided? Got it.
Thank you so much.
All right, so the RAT, the work addiction risk test, is 25 elements. It's the older of the two. It's been used in a lot of the research that you'll read, and it's criticized for some things that are going to be pretty obvious as you just glance over it. I lose my temper when things don't go my way or work out to suit me. I find myself continuing to work after my coworkers have called it quits. I get upset with myself for making even the smallest mistake. A lot of these questions don't map exclusively onto addiction. That actually map onto sort of a type A personality, as it's called in casual parlance, sort of aggressive style towards work, And there are certain elements that do map on to the addiction, but others do not. I just wanted you to have that for reference, but I've got to suggest strongly to you that if you need to assess someone in your office, or if you would like to think about for yourself whether what you're dealing with in a disordered relationship with work might be merging into an addiction, do the Bergen Work Addiction Scale. It's only 7 elements. It's very, very well, the analysis on this is very, very strong. And the way that, just go through here right now, if you want to, and mark in which column it applies to you. So just looking over on this assessment, when you've finished it, you just need to pay attention to the last 2 columns, the often and the always. For purposes of in the clinic, if there are 4 of these items for which the response is either often or always, then it's appropriate to be approaching the relationship with work as an addiction. In some research contexts, you'll see that they require actually that there be an often or always response for all 7. And that's helpful because it gives a very conservative estimate of addiction when you're trying to do it across a large population. But in the clinic and for your own purposes, often or always to 4 out of these 7 items is something that you should pay attention to. And I couldn't believe it when last week this cartoon came up on my daily calendar, which is now that I know my personality type, I have an excuse for behaving exactly the same way. All right, so negative effects from work addiction. They're pretty obvious, guys. Cardiovascular problems, sleep disruption, disordered eating that involves in weight gain. There's something called leisure sickness, which is when people actually who are workaholics actually take a break. Their immune system just shuts down because there are physical reasons for this involving how much cortisol is pumping through your system. And when you know, it's the same as when we were all in school and would make it through finals, but then get sick over vacation. That in the working world is it's called leisure sickness, and it's related to workaholism. Obviously, mental and emotional distress are associated with this addiction, relational and social disruption, and as I mentioned earlier, decreased work performance. One of the ways that it occurs, principally, is that actually people who are addicted to work, because they are so focused on themselves and the compulsion, they have increased interpersonal conflict with people at work. They tend to be nasty to their coworkers. They're so busy and so absorbed in their own suffering that is work-related that they can't tolerate fools gladly. And when, the poor guy from the mailroom comes around and drops off the wrong thing in their inbox, you might see a really ugly explosion. And this leads to performance-related problems in workplaces. It also impairs creativity. When you're exhausted and not making good decisions and certainly not able to sort of be your best at thinking about work, this can end up resulting in poor work performance. Now, let's talk about the spiritual dangers of work addiction, the part that I don't get to talk about in my secular presentation. What's really going on here is idolatry, guys. That's the golden calf right there from a medieval manuscript. The rewards of the work, whether those are the paycheck or the praise or the work itself, has supplanted God for the addict. And the sequelae to that spiritually, we know them well, but we might as well review them yet again. First of all, you start seeing people as a means to an end because you're seeing yourself as a means to an end. And so you've dehumanized others and yourself when you've taken on a work identity rather than an identity of Christ. It displaces your relationships, first and foremost with God himself, but also, of course, with family and our neighbors. And because you're misusing your time so severely, what's the first result? It's spiritual starvation. I can't make the liturgy this morning. I've got that deadline on Monday, and liturgy is 2 hours long, and it's half hour. You see what happens? You starve yourself. You're separating yourself from the source of life. And we've talked about busyness, heedless busyness, constant activity. What that is it's a desire to feel in control. It's a desire to feel important. And of course, when you have an inflated self-importance, that's going to interfere with your relationships. Your close relationships and even your casual relationships are going to be affected by that. And one thing that's also seen very often in work addiction and really is a spiritual danger is when you start to believe that you don't have limits. You really don't accept that God has created you with limitations, including need for sleep. And that's the point at which someone who is addicted to work really can end up hospitalized in a medical crisis. So for those of us who are here at OCAMPR, there's another element of this that we need to talk about, and that's when we experience work as a calling. Thanks to positive psychology and the developments of the last couple of decades, there's now a pretty substantial literature on this and all of the positive effects of experiencing an element of transcendence and pro-social motivation in your work life. Experiencing work as a calling means that you have an approach to work that reflects some sense of purpose and meaning, and that there's a way that you're using your work to contribute to the common good or to the good of individuals. You find a motivation. This is true even for for people who will say that they are not religious. When workers are motivated by some kind of external summons, the experience of work as a calling has these positive associations with career satisfaction, with a certain type of professional resilience and adaptability, and the ability to flex and engage, because you have hitched your wagon to something bigger than you. Now, I'm just going to say, everyone who's wearing a pectoral cross at this conference, all of us who are in healing professions, at some level, of course we're experiencing work as a calling. So is there a dark side to experiencing work as a calling? I'm going to say absolutely. Because it's in that calling, in feeling that your work is really, really important, that your distortion can enter, so that it becomes about you and what you're doing, not him who actually called you to do the work. And so there's now a pretty robust psychological literature on this, again, in a completely secular context, about employees who are deeply invested in the mission of the organization. Classic studies on this are animal keepers at the zoo, international aid workers, people who, obviously, doctors, mental health workers, people who are really feeling a calling and really know, it's not just that they believe it, it's that they know that what they do is critically important. Well, they tend to neglect personal boundaries. That can lead to exhaustion and stress. They can be exploited by employers who expect that they will do it almost whether or not they're paid. That is exactly the flip side of the best career advice that I had ever received from my father, who was a scientist. My dad told me, he said, "Lory, find something that you love doing so much that you would be happy to do it even if you didn't make a salary." And I applied that wisdom to decisions about what extracurriculars to do in professional school, to what kind of career to pursue. That is the positive side. The negative side is the employer who says, this person's willing to do it even if I don't pay them, because they believe that much. So exploitation is a huge issue in these industries. And then also there's the danger of genuine moral injury when the employer's agenda is completely different from the purpose that has called the worker to the job. You'll find in situations like that employers will neglect even to provide decent work conditions. There's some literature that suggests that what we're experiencing now with quiet quitting and sort of the Great Resignation is actually a reaction to this kind of abuse for purpose-driven workers. And we all know that there are structural inequities that mean that, just not everybody is going to have access to feeling like their work is a calling. So vocational identity distortion and the dark side of having a calling are particular risks for people in healing professions because they've identified vocationally with a role of being a help to others. They're genuinely doing really important work that it means that there's a temptation to blur boundaries and to say, the zebras will starve, I'll miss my daughter's birthday party. And that leads to a neglect, not only of family and friends, but also of self. And perfectionism and guilt wrapped up in sort of a failure to acknowledge limitations are all part of this distorted vocational identity. So here's some questions for reflection for you on examining your conscience with regard to vocational over-identification. How do you describe yourself to others? How quickly do you leap to tell people about your job? How much do you think about work outside of the office? And is it difficult for you to participate in conversations without turning them to your work? Is your mind constantly spinning about work, which ends up being reflected in conversations with other people, even in non-work contexts? And do all of your hobbies use your work-related skills? Or do you have some things that you do that use the other half of your brain? How lost are you in your vocational identity? If you're working remotely, how are you managing separating your time and your practices? Do others in life complain that you work too much? Obviously people who love you are going to want to spend as much time with you as they can. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about genuinely missing things that are important and genuinely neglecting relationships. And then the question that I've really given, many a workshop on, how would you feel if you could no longer do what you're doing? Your license is gone tomorrow. What does that do to your sense of self? And how distressing would that be for you? Just to be sure that we've explicitly talked about vocation. I'm going to tell the story that John Barnett tells in at least one book that I've read, and I know him personally too. About he went to the starets and said, should I become a monk? Should I marry? And the starret says, God doesn't care. These big questions that we have about what should I do are actually reinforced by our Protestant culture, in which it's really easy. We're hyper-individualists in the United States of America, so each one of us has this unique calling from God, and that involves a particular career and a particular person, and so we all spend our lives in America in so much anxiety. What if I was supposed to be an Olympic, gymnast? I missed my calling. Can we just, as Orthodox Christians, collectively take a deep breath and say, no. No, that's craziness. God reveals our vocation to us by touching our hearts. And it's not going to have necessarily even anything to do with what you think your skill set is or what you think your gifts are. He gave them to you. He knows them better than you do. And so how you will find your vocation. And let me tell you, I'm still trying. You know, I've been through a couple and I'm still working on it. It has to be informed by a daily encounter with the scripture. It has to be in prayer, because it has to be that your heart is changed. It has to be in community. And what your calling is determined by your relationship to God and your character and where you are. Because He hasn't put you where you are for any other reason. I love this. God does not tell us what to do. He reveals to us who we are. And then, with His help, we can go do it. So, how do we help people keep work in perspective? I mentioned that there are challenges to treating work addiction because abstinence is not an option. And by definition, a workaholic is somebody who is not able to find time to do anything. They don't have time for self-care. They don't have time for a weekend-long retreat. So brevity in your interventions is absolutely critical if you're going to help someone with this. There's some literature on relaxation strategies and CBT, and frankly, motivational interviewing applies pretty well in a work context because a lot of this is tied up with cognition and thinking about things. I'm going to suggest a couple of sort of off-the-wall ones. The first is start tracking your time. Really. The first is like, you know, that first step in the 12 steps, like I am. Well, let's look at how do you spend your day? How do you spend your hours? How many hours do you spend? I spent my entire legal career billing by tenths of an hour, so I actually have a pretty well-developed theology of time as a gift from God. And I hated time billing, but it actually is very beneficial in some ways spiritually, because when you realize how much time you spend doing some things, and I'm just telling you, your phone will automatically tell you how much time you spent doing some things. Take that seriously too. It's helpful. And then I've got a little intervention that I'm calling the micro eco solace, and then I want to talk about humility. So, tracking your time, work-life balance. Guess what? There's a commandment about this. The Sabbath is a gift from God. It's holy. And you know what? Orthodox theology on the Sabbath is really messy. Someday maybe I'll figure that out, but I'm just telling you, there's a component of that you have to grab onto when the issue you're struggling with is work. So, take that commandment seriously, and I don't mean, that we patronize Chick-fil-A because they're closed on Sundays. I mean that God has told us He Himself took a Sabbath. We need to find a way to set aside some time. And that setting aside time isn't so that you can collapse and escape and scroll and, it has to be something that you do actually with intention and discipline. It's a to-do list item. Sorry, guys. You have to work at making it something that is meaningful so that you can intentionally participate in things that will bring you closer to God and bring you closer to your family. Put it on your calendar, however you manage it, but on that Sabbath, which doesn't necessarily have to be Sunday depending on your work, but on that Sabbath, in that Sabbath time, call the great aunt that you haven't talked to in weeks. You know what? She is going to die. Call her. Talk to her. Do it. Spend time looking in someone's face and relate to them. And go to church. Go to a weekday liturgy. You'd be amazed at how much theology there is in those hymns. Just amazed. So set aside that time and bring to your reality a Sabbath rest. And that's not work-life balance. Sorry, there's no such thing as work-life balance. They're just choices. That's a whole different presentation. It's a Sabbath. It's holy to God. Now, this is my little micro eco solace. Again, realistically, for people who are too busy, it needs to be short. Just go outside. Just step outside and find something beautiful. Seconds. I went out, at sunrise, just to find something beautiful, even though I was supposed to be reviewing my slides. And you know what? Not only did I see the beautiful sunrise, but on this little platform over here on the stone wall, there was this amazingly huge spider. I mean, whoa! I didn't take a picture because I was afraid it might trigger some arachnophobes or something like that. But great, big, beautiful sunrise, amazing itty bitty little creature. It took less than 5 minutes, and it framed the day in a completely different way. It gave me an encounter, an opportunity to experience awe. And awe is actually a critical component of the virtue of humility. So I'm going to suggest to you that if you strive to anchor your work identity in humility, it is going to be a buffer against all of these unhealthy things that we've been talking about. And what does that mean? Does it mean I'm so terrible, I'm so bad? No, it's not. It's not self-abasement, it's an accurate self-assessment. I have some really good training from some really good institutions. I know what I'm good at. I can always learn more. There are other people who are even better at many things than I am. And guess what? In any institution, power can be shared. And will probably be better served for the entire organization if it's not in the hands of just one person. So all those elements of idolization and even exploitation can be diminished if you have both the interpersonal and intrapersonal perspective of humility. So let's do a real quick thing that you guys will probably hate, but I'm gonna offer it to you as an exercise. I do not pray for humility because I'm scared to, and I do not ever want you to humiliate anyone else, but I've got a somatic exercise that might help with just getting over yourself a little bit. So can everybody stand up, please? And take a deep breath. Just sort of wiggle out. All right? Now I'm going to start with what I call the square prayer, which is find something that's a rectangle or a square and look at it. The top line is the first line of the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now take a deep breath. Exhale. If you can, close your eyes and smile. Just smile really broadly. Just smile. There's nothing funny, it's just allowing joy. Alright, when you feel okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Now, I want you to breathe deeply, shake out your nose, and we're going to do a laughter exercise. Laughter gets a bad rap in the fathers, and inappropriate laughter is not a good thing, but this is the kind of laughter which hopefully will bring us closer to each other and a little bit less concerned about how we look to others. So let's do, first of all, I want you to inhale and then exhale with a ha! Inhale. Ha! And smile while you do it. Inhale. Ha! All right, now let's do a milkshake. We're going to go ha! 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 Come on, my milkshake brings those oxytocin and those endorphins. All right, and a big breath in and out. And in and out. All right, some of you are actually smiling. Some of you are actually smiling. Go ahead and sit down and let's talk about what humility looks like at work. It's imitating Christ, which means when people are nasty to you, when they say bad things about you, you're bearing those insults and the injustice and the suffering without coming back at them, without saying, how dare you. It's like you can absorb it. You might even be able to take it as an opportunity to learn. It's about seeing nothing at work as beneath you. The guy from the mailroom who put the wrong thing in your basket, his job is no more important than yours, no less important than yours, and no person is beneath you. That's the lesson of the publican and the Pharisee. Christ gives us everything we need to know about humility and how he himself behaved. And of course, Dorotheus of Gaza gives us a beautiful discourse on how humility is actually the mortar that holds together every other virtue. It's super hard to have virtues like obedience and discretion and courage and even faith without humility to hold it all together, and then also to keep you from falling off the roof when you think you might be getting a little bit too lofty in your own assessment of your own humility. And so I'm encouraging you to cultivate that humility, practice self-awareness, engage in self-reflection, seek some feedback from people that you trust, and listen to the feedback you get, even from people you don't trust. Be teachable and listen actively. Embrace gratitude. And I have a very dear Greek friend who tells me that metania literally means over yourself. Get over yourself. Laugh a little bit. Be laughed at comfortably. It's not too scary, really, it's not. So another thing that we can do is think about how we can witness through work, and that's a posture of vocational stewardship. This isn't about evangelizing in the workplace. It's not even just about managing resources. This is really about cultivating excellence and being a healing presence where you are. Just being a blessing in your workplace, and that the line from Jeremiah, again, it's a glimpse into sort of how we are to behave. Just, you're in exile, you're in Babylon, you're in a place you don't want to be. Pray to the Lord for it. Build your houses, plant your gardens, do your work joyfully and with prayer. The city will be blessed. The city will be blessed. And then finally, we're not going to have a disordered relationship with work if we know for whom we're working. And so that's really the problem with idolatry, is that we forget that it's all for God. And St. John Chrysostom actually has this fantastic quote, saying, "The servant performs all he does for the pleasure of his master and seeks nothing more than his master's approving glance. He doesn't dry out the eyes of others to his work, even if those others are really great, but he regards one thing only, how the master regards his work." So, there's my take-home Guarding Against Work edition. I'm going to say, pray, study the scriptures, go to church, listen to, or better yet, sing the theology. Adopt a posture of stewardship towards your work. You're doing it for God. Get outside. Allow yourself to be a little bit awed by God's creation in some tiny way. Take a Sabbath rest, even if it's not a whole day. Just take a Sabbath rest. Have that rhythm in your life. And please try to take yourself just a little bit less seriously. Do a laugh. All right, I can open it up to questions. I wanted to point out, these are two books that I thought are just absolutely fabulous. The John Barnett essay is one of many in the collection Christ at Work. Dysfunction in the Name of Jesus is a collection of essays by Protestant ministers, and it's really profound. It describes a multitude of ways in which those who are serving the Lord can end up with the absolute best intentions in the absolute worst kind of idolatry because of the pressures. I mean, just think about it. A priest now is expected to not only be a minister of the sacraments, but your psychologist, your marriage counselor, your media guru, your website manager, your your youth leader. The roles are unbelievable. And to the extent that your clergyman is trying to do all of that, it's no wonder that some of him gets wrapped up in that. So this is so for those of you who are working with priests or have a priest that you recommend, I really like that. It was very hard for me to pick just a handful of my favorite literature in this area. I'm really happy to share my longer list of references with anybody who's interested. But I can also open it up to questions and comments. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. So beautifully said. My question is around so-called messaging that's supposed to be inspiring but has a dark side. Like, if you're a fill in the blank, it could be a woman, you have to work twice as hard. Or, grandpa had a fruit stand, you own the whole block. That kind of thing. When you're looking at success in the world, that could also explode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, each of those examples that you gave, wow. Talk about the expectations that are packed in and the pressure. It's always a really hard balance, and I'm actually struggling with teaching my kids this because we have to have a work ethic. We have to strive. We have to work. Work is our means for salvation in almost all situations. Very few of us are going to have a exclusively contemplative life. It's we're going to be working. So we have to have a really good work ethic, but we have to have that work ethic be wrapped not around our own pride or some definition of success either that we formulate or that gets foisted onto us by, the well-intended aunt, who expects, great things. It all has to be directed to God. It all has to be for the glory of God. And that's not easy to navigate, especially in our secular culture. Because the only thing that anybody else is measuring is, how big is your fruit stand? And that's the reality, and so there's a requirement to humbly accept that other people may think that you're not making the most of what you've been given. So long as you and God know, I would say, what other people think is for them to think. But I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying that easy. And also, in humility, if someone is saying to you, you should be doing this better, you should be doing something different, well, think about if that's where's that message coming from? It may be that you need to do something differently. It may be that you can do something better. Because let me tell you, another entire presentation I'd like to give is on laziness. We're all drawn to that, and there are modern ways of hiding laziness so that it looks productive that are really, really dangerous, because you can convince yourself that you're not a lazy person. And then that kind of delusion can be really spiritually dangerous.
Do we know anything about heritability of workaholic patterns or workaholism?
There absolutely, and it's really interesting. Is it genetic or is it environmental? Right. That hasn't been parsed out, but children of workaholics far more likely to have addiction of all sorts, including workaholism, and children of addicts generally are strongly more inclined to be workaholics. There is a very clear connection intergenerationally in the literature, and that's not surprising. One mechanism that does seem to have been studied pretty well is actually parentification. So and this is something you see a lot in immigrant communities where the parents were working all the time. The kids had to kind of step up and behave as parents. And then those parentified children grew up themselves to be workaholics. So even though in the traditional immigration story, they're like professionals when the parents had been like merchants, the harm comes out in their disordered relationship with their professional work. Yeah, there's literature on that.
I have a question, like, what do you think about like systems or just workplaces that just foster it and like they breed it? Because it felt like in order to get through grad school, I had to functionally be a workaholic. And so like even just checking some of these checklists off, I could, at an earlier point, I could have checked them all pretty high, but it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because I had to.
Right, it was situational.
Situationally,
Definitely.
I was functionally a workaholic.
Definitely.
And so it self-selects for that sort of stuff. All the teachers in the institution certainly are far down along that path. So just, and then the impact that has broader on the field.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's, that is a whole different topic.
Yeah.
And there's a really great book. I didn't put it on there's a new book just recently published by a psychologist that I met this summer, who's a former, like special forces guy. I mean, he's like leadership on steroids, not literally. And it's like the new workplace resilience, and it's all about workplace institutions and leadership and how leadership influences the context organizationally. And academics, law firms, I think to a certain extent hospitals, they're all really calcified, and so there are ways of doing things that reinforce precisely these incentives to overwork and frankly exploitation. Even though the university wasn't necessarily making money off of you in like a huge way, it is an exploitation of you, because in order to get that degree, you have to jump how high. And
Yeah, they're the gatekeepers. In
Absolutely.
the ethics code, that's what they're from.
Absolutely. And there are still many professions in which an explicit part of the formation is, work-related excess and suffering.
Yeah.
And, examining whether that's actually an important thing to train in is, it's very important. And there are some situations in which it is actually important to be trained in suffering. I mean, I would not want our war fighters to not be able to endure hardship. I'm not so sure our psychologists really need to be able to go for 6 weeks and only eating MREs. That's like
There's military Navy SEAL that was calling me on the phone often with some extra stuff that was going on in his particular case. But he explained some of his experience was like similar to some of the trainings they gave him early on in his training.
And that's definitely true. That's definitely true in medical school. I mean, like those sort of excesses are deliberately part of the experience, and institutionally, I think it's really an important question. And organizations are complicated. It's not so easy as they're just out to make money and so they want to get us addicted, although that's true too.
It's a culture.
It is. It's a culture, and it's a culture of individualism and individual accomplishment. And I'll just repeat something from last year's OCAMPR session that is, I think, really important, which is we're in a culture of war, and the prevalent culture in the United States is that of absolutely outright in-your-face individualism that is contrary in so many ways to the Orthodox ethos and to what God has revealed to us as true, but we are not among the combatants. We need to be the Red Cross. We need to be there for the combatants in this culture of war. So we have to consolidate what we know ourselves to be true and understand that we're not going to be able to take on every institution to fix it. Our best chance is, that vocational stewardship, to be a blessing where you work and a leader that can influence the organizational structure you're in, because that's where God has put you.
Let's give Lory a round of applause.